I don't know Bill as well as I'd like to, but what I do know of him and the books that I've read are excellent. And I know he has a heart not only for this nation, but he has a heart for God. And we appreciate that. And as we said earlier, if ever there were a time when we need the Lord to intervene, if there were a time we need revival in this nation, it's today. And it must begin in each one of us. It's not going to begin in a church. We are the church. It must begin in each one of us. And as we sang in the first song, oh, there's a time and we will make a stand, and we are making a stand. But the greatest stand you're going to make is when you are seeking the face of God. And when you walk in righteousness, we've been ministering on righteousness for many weeks now on Sunday mornings, and what the Word of God really means and what it reference to righteousness. The effectual, fervent prayer of a righteous man or woman avails much. The enemy doesn't care how you live as long as you don't live according to the Word of God. Doesn't care how much you pray unless you're walking in holiness. Now, if you're walking in holiness, he dreads to see you get up in the morning because you'll be able to touch the heart of God. It's why he said, if my people, which are called by my name, would humble themselves and pray, seek my face, and turn from the wicked ways. That's the key. Then will I hear from heaven. I will forgive their sin, and I will heal their land. He didn't say if all the world would. He said if my people. And God is making a line. He's drawing the line. And I know that our brother's going to minister to us, and we want to give him the time to do so. So, Brother Rob, if you'll pray over the offering, I'd appreciate it. And as our brother is coming, I also, as one pastor in the community, I pray that all pastors will rise up and begin to speak the truth, and to speak it in the pulpits, and to declare the truth to all the people, and ultimately to the nations. Would you give our brother a hand?
Thank you. Amen. Amen. Well, thank you, Pastor. And join me in thanking the Lord for such a tremendous pastor right here in this wonderful church and community. Thank you, Pastor. I'm very impressed with Pastor's understanding of Scripture, his understanding of the importance of Israel and us supporting Israel, and God's hand on the church and calling us back to Him in this time. Well, I have several books that I wanted to mention before I get into my talk. One is called Who is the King in America? And it's an overview of all the world's history. The most common form of government's a king. Kings have subjects. As the centuries go on, the kingdoms get bigger because with military advancements, the king can kill more people, right? Instead of killing with a rock, they kill with a bronze weapon or an iron weapon or gunpowder. But ultimately, the King of England was the biggest. Sun never set on the British Empire. He was a globalist. He had all of India, Australia, New Zealand, and so forth. And America's founders broke away and flipped it and made the people the king. So the word citizen is Greek. It means co-king, right? So you're a citizen of America. You are a co-king of America. Where did the founders get the idea? From the New England pastors, Connecticut, New Hampshire. And they got their idea from the Bible. What part of the Bible? That first 400-year period when Israel came out of Egypt, before they got King Saul. And so anyway, there's more to that book, but I'll end with that. Another is called Miracles in American History. And this is inspiring because it's times in our country's past where there's a crisis, they pray, and things turn around. Revolution, War of 1812, Civil War, Barbary Pirate War, so forth. Well, anyway, let me get into my talk tonight. I do have a website, AmericanMinute.com, and I send out a daily email that you can sign up for. And the first recorded civilization is Nimrod, Tower of Babel. God comes down, confuses the languages, the people scatter, but it's almost like every generation since tries to rebuild the Tower of Babel, but only on a bigger scale. I thought it was interesting in geometry, there's something called the Fibonacci sequence or the golden ratio or phi. It's a rate of expansion that you observe in a seashell or a tornado or a hurricane or a galaxy, right? It spins. And it gets applied to other areas, like investments. An investment advisor will see a investment growing at a certain rate, and he goes, hey, this probably will grow this big and this big. But nobody had applied it to history. So I decided I would examine all the empires in world history, and lo and behold, they grow at the same rate. And so people say history repeats itself. Yeah, but every time it comes around, it's a little bit worse. So you got Nimrod, Tower of Babel, but then you got Gilgamesh, king of Uruk, around 2500 BC, and then Sargon of Akkadian, 2250 BC, and then you got 2,000 years of Egyptian pharaohs and 5,000 years of Chinese emperors, and then around 700 BC, Assyria has the biggest empire, but it's conquered by Babylon, with Nebuchadnezzar, which is conquered by Cyrus of Persia, and he had the biggest empire, but it's conquered by Alexander the Great. He has the biggest empire, and then he stopped from going into India by Chandragupta, and he's got the biggest empire. And then you got Augustus Caesar, around 25 BC, and he has the biggest empire. And then the Aksumite Empire is huge in Africa, and then Attila the Hun in the 450 AD, he has the biggest empire. It's wiping out cities across Europe, and then Justinian, the Byzantine Empire, and then Islam comes along. And from 622 to 632, Muhammad conquers through Arabia, and then the rightly guided caliphs conquer all of Egypt, which used to be Christian, Syria, which used to be Christian, North Africa used to have 250 Catholic dioceses. Then they invaded Spain, and then they conquered all of Turkey, and they conquered from the Persian Gulf to the Atlantic Ocean. They had the biggest empire, but they're stopped from conquering Europe by Charles Martel. And his grandson is Charlemagne, and he's got this biggest empire in Europe. And then the Vikings have boats with low keels. They go up every river in Europe, every river in Russia. I mean, they're conquering the world for 2 centuries, and they got the biggest empire. And then Genghis Khan in the 1200s. He conquers from Korea to Hungary and kills 30 million people. And then his grandson's Kublai Khan runs China. 1300s, Tamerlane. He controls this huge area, Central Asia. And then Ivan the Terrible. If you've seen a map of Russia, it's 12 time zones. It's enormous. And then you cross the ocean, and you have the Aztec Empire ruled by Montezuma. And in South America, you have the Inca Empire ruled by Atahualpa. But the 1500s, the King of Spain has the largest empire that planet Earth had ever seen. The sun never set on the Spanish Empire. They control all the New World. Right? The Philippines are named after, the King Philip of Spain. And then in the 1600s, the King of France has the biggest empire. Did you know he used to own the land that we're on? Right, King of France. But then in the 1800s, the King of England had the largest empire that planet Earth had ever seen. The King of England was a globalist. He was a one-world government guy with him at the top. And America's founders said they didn't like this globalist king telling us what to do, so they broke away and they flipped it and they made the people the king. And so you see this desire for power to concentrate. If any of these dictators had not died, they would have been glad to have the whole world under their thumb. I mean, here's Mao Zedong kills 80 million people. If he hadn't died, he'd continue to kill. And so in that sense, death is a blessing because the devil has to start from scratch again. And you think of the devil, remember Jesus is being tempted and the devil comes to him and says, bow down and worship me, and I'll give you all the kingdoms of the world because they're mine to give, and I can give them to whoever I want. It's like, whoa, that's pretty audacious. When did you get them? When Adam sinned. Adam was in charge of the garden. How do we know? He named everything. Naming implies you have authority over it. So Adam's naming it. He has authority in the garden. But the Bible says, to whomever you yield your members servants to obey, to him you are a servant. The moment Adam obeyed Satan, he was posturing himself as the obeyer, and the devil is the one that was in charge. So the devil usurped the power and became the god of this world system. And so all of the kings of this world ruled through fear, right? And then Jesus came, right, conquered the devil, and the kingdoms of this world shall become the kingdoms of our Lord, and he shall reign forever and ever. But clearly there's a global goal in mind. So we go from Cain killing Abel, and then kings taking kingdoms from other kings, and Nimrod, and the thousands of years of pharaohs and Caesars and Kaisers. Clearly there's a global goal in mind. Watch that Fibonacci sequence. It eventually wants to take over the world. And Jesus says the wheat and tares grow together till the harvest. And so if we get through this crisis, there'll be another one. We get through that crisis, there'll be another one. The crisis of the era is, in a sense, the opportunity for us to show whose side we're on. And I liken it to sort of a self-sorting out of the sheep and the goats. It's not the ultimate sorting out where the Lord, we say, Lord, when were you naked and we clothed you? It's not that. But it's sort of on a small level. The crisis of each era is an opportunity for the believers of that era to either run and hide and give up or run to the need and minister love to the unlovable, defend the defenseless, stand up for the righteousness, right? Anyway, I'm getting preachy there. Now, since the default setting for human government is kings, we got bullies on a playground. You put a bunch of kids on a playground, one's the bully. You put some junior high girls in a clique, one of them is the diva. You're her friend, you're on the inside. If you're not her friend, they can be really mean. You put some people in the woods, one of them is an Indian chief. You put them in an inner city, one of them is a gang leader. And all a king is a glorified gang leader, right? And it's hierarchical. You're friends with the king, you're more equal. You're not friends with the king, you're less equal. You're an enemy of the king, you're dead. It's called treason, or you're a slave. And so what if you were the king? You would do it right. We all think that. But let's say you have a sister, you really love her, she gets married, has a kid. Now he's a teenager. Now he's hanging around the wrong kids, and he's drinking and partying, and he hits someone with the car and kills him. And now this teenager is facing manslaughter charges, mandatory prison time, and your sister comes begging to you. And says, you're not going to let my little Johnny get locked away, are you? It wasn't his fault. Those other kids talked him into it, blah, blah, blah. What are you going to say to your sister? Well, I'll let little Johnny off the hook this time, but don't let it happen again. Guess what? As soon as you say that, you are the corrupt dictator. You just set ripples through your kingdom, that if somebody's family or friends with the king, they get special treatment. If they're not family or friends, they don't get it. And if someone wants to point out your favoritism, you will be tempted to want to shut them up. So it just happens. Power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. So the idea was to take the power and scatter it, like God did at the Tower of Babel. Take that concentrated power, Nimrod, and scatter it. And that's what our founders did. They took the power of the king of England and they scattered it, right? On the state level and on the local level and on the community level. And then they tied up the federal government with 10 handcuffs. We call the first 10 amendments. They wanted to, all the Constitution is a bunch of hurdles to prevent power from reconcentrating back into the hands of a king. And so we got some rare experiments of people ruling themselves without a king. And we don't really notice it until you read all the history. So I spent a couple of years researching every single century of recorded human history. And I said, now, what's the government in, the 25th century BC? What was the main government 24th century BC and 23rd? I mean, I went through them all, and I proved without a doubt it's kings, Pharaoh, Caesar, Kaiser, Sultan, Tsar. The name changes, but power concentrates into the hands of one. Very few examples of people ruling themselves without a king. The most notable ones are the Hebrew Republic. That's that first 400-year period when Israel came out of Egypt. And it worked until the priests stopped teaching the law. Every man did what was right in their own eyes, turns into chaos, and they get King Saul. The Greek democracy, until Alexander the Great's dad conquered them. And then the Roman Republic until Julius Caesar came along and made himself dictator for life. But we take the power of a king and we put power in the hands of the people. What we experienced in America and in these other different republics and democracies was a polarity change in the flow of power. Instead of top-down rule by kings, it's bottom-up rule by we. And it's the difference between a dead pyramid and a living tree, where every root and every little capillary root sucks in nutrients to help keep the tree alive. So every single citizen is needed to keep this bottom-up form of government working. Even the little tiny little capillary roots in the everything, everyone is needed to make this thing work. And it's the difference between divine right of kings and we the people. Now, kings rule through fear, and the people, democracies and republics, rule when the people have virtue. That's what Montesquieu, the French political philosopher, that was the most quoted philosopher by the founding fathers that wrote the Constitution. Montesquieu said, kings rule through fear. That's the spring, like you have a watch with a spring inside of it. He says that's the motivating power of dictatorships is fear. And the motivating power of republics and democracies is the people being in charge, but the people need to have virtue. Right? And now here's the question for my my presentation tonight. How does a democracy or republic revert back to a dictatorship? So let's say somebody wants to be the dictator, and it's a republic or democracy. Hey, everybody, I wanted you to give up all your rights and freedoms to me. They're not going to want to do that. So you have to come up with a plan. And so the plan is twofold. Take the power of the king, separate it into the hands of the people, but how do you get it back into the hands of a king? One is fear. When people are in fear, they will trade freedom for security. And the second is give away free stuff, and they will trade freedom for dependency. And so with those two, that's how a drug dealer takes over a neighborhood. They can come in and have fear, and with guns and shoot, and everybody panics, and if there's no policeman around, the people will cave to the fear, and they will agree to pay the mob protection money, and the mob will take over the neighborhood through violence. Or the drug dealer can give away free drugs and get everybody hooked. And once they're hooked, they say, "Do you want some more drugs? You got to sell yourself into prostitution. You want some more drugs? You've got to steal from your neighbor." And so the idea, that's sort of a premise. And so the book I wrote, Socialism, every study of socialism goes back to Plato. Lived 380 BC in Athens. And it was a democracy, people rule, but we're going to see how that basically it's socialism is a sales campaign to revert back to dictatorship. It's like a bait and switch. Promises freedom, but it ends up taking it away. And so Plato, in passing, writes about Atlantis, this highly structured civilization on an island that's very organized, and it sinks in the ocean. And now whether it existed or not, nobody knows for sure, but there is an island in the Mediterranean, a Greek island called Santorini, and it is what's left of a volcano. And I visited it in college, and it is a real cool little island. It got these cliffs of what's left of the volcano and all these white buildings with blue. It's really pretty. And so that could have been it, but certainly when it blew up, it would have sent a tsunami wave all across the Mediterranean, destroying lots of civilizations. So who knows? So Plato considered Atlantis this very structured, ideal civilization, and Plato considered democracy an unstructured society, right? So we got structure, we have unstructured. Democracy, demos means people, krasi means rule, and the chief characteristic of a democracy is tolerance. Everybody tolerates each other. It's wonderful. And then they tolerate people that are a little bit off. Then they tolerate people that are a lot off. Till finally they're tolerating crooks and crime and fraud, and it turns into lawlessness, looting, rioting in the streets, random violence, and everybody panics and says, we need somebody to come along and fix this mess. And that's when some governor comes along and he says, I can fix it, I just need some emergency powers. And Plato says at first he's all smiles, and then he stands up in the chariot of state holding the reins of power. He's revealed as the tyrant, right? So the rubber band's head snapped back. So these are the different quotes. Plato says, the state is like a bazaar, which you can buy anything, a piece of embroidery, greatest variety of human natures, and such is democracy, a pleasing, lawless sort of government, full of variety and disorder. The manner of life is that of Democrats. Now, that's his word because he is describing a democracy. Every man does what is right in his own eyes. And they begin to tolerate disrespect in the home. The father gets accustomed to descend to the level of his son and fear him, and the son having no fear or shame of the parents. And then disrespect is tolerated in the classroom. The teacher fears and flatters his students. The students despise his masters and tutors. And then they see that there's a pot of city money treasury sitting there, and they vote to spread the wealth around. Now the treasury is empty. And then they vote to take the money from the rich and spread it around. The leaders deprive the rich of their estates and distribute them amongst the people. And then they tolerate immorality. And it says the young man, this is Plato, the young man passes into freedom and libertinism of useless and unnecessary pleasures. There is no conceivable folly or crime not accepting incest or any other unnatural union. Yes, that's what he's talking about. Matter of fact, a study was done in 1934 by Oxford anthropologist J.D. Unwin, titled Sex and Culture. He's not a Christian, he's just an anthropologist, and he studied Athens 180 civilizations over 5,000 years. And he found out something, that loosening of sexual restraints always leads to civilizational decline. And he says that civilizations go through 4 stages. The first is a period of pain and poverty. They go through war, they go through famine, right? Egypt, the Israelites were in slavery. And then they come out of that, and they work hard, and they become productive. And then they become protective, and then all of them together become patriotic. And then they finally get prosperous. And then they want to enjoy their prosperity. And they get promiscuous, indulgent, undisciplined, lawless, and weakened, and they get conquered by the next rising civilization. It's like an athlete. When he's young, he's disciplined, focused, exercises, watches his diet. He wants that championship. And finally, he gets it, and he is the champ for a couple seasons. And then he maybe doesn't exercise quite as much, and maybe he starts eating fatty stuff, and in his mind, he still thinks he's the champ, and he gets challenged into the ring of competition, and he still thinks he's the tough guy, but he gets the tar knocked out of him because in reality, he's a couch potato. And now, this cycle, J.D. Unwin, in his book, again, he's not a Christian, he calls it a sexual marketplace. And he says, when the women as a whole say nothing happens unless there is a commitment, the guys say, well, whatever it takes, they make the commitment, right? And then they go out and be productive to bring back the support their wife. And then something appears, little kids, and the guy has a new emotion. It's called being protective. And so when all the men of the country become productive and protective, rising water floats all boats. The whole country becomes productive and protective and patriotic and industrious and creative and expansionistic, right? But where the women say there does not need to be a commitment, the guys say, well, you know, water seeks its own level, and if I can get some pleasure without any commitment, fine, right? And you get guys being selfish. And they're all focused on their own pleasure and selfishness, and there's fewer kids born to fill the ranks of the military. And when enough of the men of the country do this, the country gets weakened. And they get conquered by the next rising civilization. So John Adams writes to Thomas Jefferson, have you ever found in history one single example of a nation thoroughly corrupted that was afterwards restored to virtue? And without virtue, there can be no political liberty. Will you tell me how to prevent luxury from producing effeminacy? Intoxication, extravagance, vice, folly. No effort in favor of virtue is lost. Truman put it this way, without a firm moral foundation, freedom degenerates quickly into selfishness and anarchy. So Plato, we're back to him. He says that democracies, they're going to tolerate each other, it's great. Then they're going to tolerate people that are a little bit off, and tolerate people that are a lot off, and they're going to tolerate lawlessness and chaos and immorality and sexual perversion. And before you know it, it's going to turn into an unstructured mess. And then the people are going to say, we need somebody to come along and fix it, and some governor comes along, I can fix it, I just need some emergency powers. Plato says that last of all comes the tyrant. When he first appears above ground, he's the protector. He's full of smiles. Now, I'm going to take away your rights and freedoms, but I'm doing this to protect you. Right? And then when he gets enough of the power, Plato says that he stands up in the chariot of state with the reins in his hand, revealed as a tyrant. And then Plato even put this, having a mob entirely at his disposal. He's not restrained from shedding of blood. So he incites the mob to go after his political opponents and smashes their windows and so forth. Now, Plato says that a democracy is doomed to fail because it's based on the people having virtue. And people really don't have virtue because if you give them a choice of giving up their life or giving up their virtue, they'll always give up their virtue to save their life. Now, Israel's attempt to rule themselves without a king lasted a little longer because they had a big magnet in the sky called God, and people were virtuous because they were accountable to this God. Athens did not have that. By Plato's time, Athens had a bunch of fickle deities that nobody believed in anyway. And so Plato says, this experiment's going to fail, right? And so Plato even said this. He said, if someone was born that truly had virtue, the world would crucify him. He writes this in 380 BC. If a truly just man lived, let him die as he lived. I might add that the just man will be scourged, racked, bound, and will at last be crucified. He wrote that 380 years before Christ. So Plato concluded the best you can hope for is a nice tyrant. Democracy is going to fail sooner or later, so the best you hope for is a nice tyrant. He called him a philosopher king. And he is going to institute structure. So he is the head of gold. And his administrators and military are the arms and chest of silver. They are the deep state ruling class. And everyone else is the abdomen of iron and bronze. They are the ruled class. So socialism goes back to Plato. It's a structured society of a deep state ruling class and everyone else. And now the ruling class, they're above the law. They're politically connected. They can dole out favors. They're supported by the commoners. They can do things like getting their hair styled when nobody else can. And if you remember the news anyway. The ruled class. Plato says that yes, everyone will be provided for, but no one owns any property. The property's all held in common and controlled by the ruling class. There are no families. The government decides who gets to have children. The government takes the children away from the parents and brings them into the city, indoctrinates them with noble lies, and the children are socialized, which is a concept of getting them to give up their own idea of being an individual and just serve the ruling class and obey them. And so Plato says that in this structured society, when the true philosopher kings are born in a state, they will set in order. We're talking about structure, their own city. They will take possession of the children who will be unaffected by the habits of their parents. These they will train in their own habits and laws. And these children will be taught noble lies. He says, we want one single grand lie, which will be believed by everybody. Could you imagine the kids being taken away from the parents and taught noble lies? And anyway, so Plato, 380 BC, his island of Atlantis, inspired 2 centuries later, Sir Thomas More, shortly after Columbus discovers America, and he writes Island of Utopia. And the word utopia means nowhere. It's a fictitious island he made up off the coast of South America, supposedly discovered by Amerigo Vespucci. But he writes it as a Greek dialogue because he's referring back to Plato. And in this dialogue, it's a conversation with a traveler named Hythlodaeus, which means peddler of nonsense. So we have the island of nowhere told to us by the peddler of nonsense. And on this island of utopia, it's perfectly structured. There is an upper class and the lower class commoners, and there's free health care. There's free identical clothing. Everyone receives free welfare. There's free meals in monastic communal dining halls, and everyone lives in identical, free, 3-story public housing. There is no locks on any doors. There's no private property. All property and goods are stored in a communal warehouse. There are no taverns, no alehouses, no coffee houses, no places for private gatherings, no privacy. Everyone is tracked everywhere you go with an internal passport. If you're caught without it, it's a lifetime of slavery. And the government decides everyone's careers, and there are no families in Sir Thomas More's utopia. Childbearing is regulated by the government, sort of like China's one-child policy, or Planned Parenthood's Margaret Sanger, who said, no woman shall have a legal right to bear a child without a permit. So we have Plato's Island of Atlantis, inspired Sir Thomas More. Now, Sir Thomas More wrote it as a veiled criticism of Henry VIII. He's the king that switched from Catholic to Anglican, and if you didn't go along with him, you got killed, and Sir Thomas More was a stick in the mud. He didn't go along with him, and Henry VIII killed Sir Thomas More. Well, then the next century, you have Sir Francis Bacon, and he writes New Atlantis. He names it New Atlantis because he is directly referring to Plato's Atlantis. This perfectly structured. And so Francis Bacon's New Atlantis is a fictitious island in the South Pacific. And highly structured, ruling class commoners, a little more scientific careers because he helped start the scientific revolution. And someone wrote a satire on this that you have read or watched the movie of, Jonathan Swift's Gulliver's Travels. Here's Gulliver, washed up on an island, and it's highly structured with this ridiculous ruling class controlling everyone's lives, and then the ruling class that just has to work their jobs. Why is this important? The Pilgrims. This is the time the Pilgrims are coming to America. They don't have any money, so they go to some rich people in England to underwrite it, and the rich people form a company, right? The London Company, and this company has bylaws. And they wrote the bylaws. They got an opportunity to say, hey, we get a chance to set up a brand new community on the other side of the world, and let's just have it be perfect. Let's just have it be ideal. Let's look at Plato and Sir Thomas More and Sir Francis Bacon, and they write the bylaws. The Pilgrims tried it, but this is the bylaws for the Pilgrim Company. All profits and benefits that are got by trade, traffic, trucking, working, fishing, or any other means shall remain in ye common stock. And all are to have their meat, drink, and apparel and provision out of ye common stock. They tried it and almost starved to death because nobody was motivated to do the extra stuff that needed to be done, and they had a couple really tough winters. And so William Bradford said the failure of that experiment of communal service, which was tried for several years by good and honest men, proves the emptiness of the theory of Plato and other ancients applauded by some of latter times. I just think that's amazing. He mentions Plato. Here's the governor of the Pilgrims. They knew that they were trying to take this theoretical Plato's or Thomas More's or Francis and try to actually live this thing out. They tried it. It's the emptiness of the theory of Plato. He says that the taking away of private property and possession of it in community would make a state happy and flourishing, as if they were wiser than God. For in this instance, community of property was found to breed much confusion and discontent and retard much employment, which would have been to the general benefit. For the young men who were most able and fit for service objected to being forced to spend their time and strength in working for other men's wives and children without any recompense. The strong man or the resourceful man had no more share of food, clothes, etc., than the weak man who was not able to do a quarter what the other could. This was thought injustice. The aged and graver men, who were ranked and equalized in labor, food, clothes, etc., with the humbler and younger ones, thought it some indignity and disrespect to them. As for men's wives, who were obliged to do service for other men, such as cooking, washing their clothes, etc., they considered it a kind of slavery, and many husbands would not brook it or allow it. He goes on, let none argue that this is due to human failing, rather than to this communistic plan of life in itself. He uses the word communistic. I answer that God in his wisdom saw that another plan of life was fitter for them. So they began to consider how to raise more corn and obtain a better crop so they might not endure the misery of want and starve through winter. After much debate, the governor, with the chief among them, allowed each man to plant corn for his own household. Wow, what a novel idea. So every family was assigned a parcel of land. This was very successful. It made all hands very industrious so that much more corn was planted than otherwise would have been by any means and gave far better satisfaction. The women now went willingly into the field and took their little ones with them to plant corn, while before they would allege weakness and inability, and to have compelled them would have been thought great oppression. Right? So they tried this theoretical Plato, Sir Thomas More, Sir Francis Bacon. It didn't work. They scrapped it. They gave everybody their own plot of land, and then you worked it, and it was successful. Now, what if older fish could tell younger fish to stay away from shiny things dangling in the water? But they can't. So every new generation of younger fish sees this shiny fishing lure, and they're attracted to it, and they get caught. Socialism is a shiny thing dangling in the water. Free food, free clothes, free education, free welfare. Free is attractive. The only problem is there's a hook. Now, didn't the early church own everything in common? Like, isn't socialism sort of Christian? Well, let's look a little deeper. It's the difference between voluntary and involuntary and church versus government. So the early believers voluntarily sold their land and laid the money at the feet of the apostles to redistribute. They were not forced to involuntarily sell their land and lay the money at the feet of Pilate for the Roman government to redistribute. Now, in the Bible, they go into the promised land, and God gives property to each family permanently. If you own property, you can accumulate stuff. The Bible called that being blessed. And if you own stuff, you can be moved upon in your heart to give away some of your stuff. That is called charity. And, even in the Bible, there's the parable of the guy that worked really hard and multiplied his minas or talents till he had 10, and then the one guy that buried it. And Jesus says, take the one from the one guy and give it to the 10. And it says that they say, sir, he already has 10. He replied, I tell you that everyone that has more will be given, but to him that has nothing, even what he has will be taken away. In other words, God blesses those that do something, right, with what he's given you. And so if Jesus was a socialist, he would have said, no, take from the 10 and distribute it amongst all of them. Now, Lenin said socialism is a transition phase to communism, and Karl Marx says communism can be summed up in one sentence: abolition of private property. So if you do not own anything, how can you be charitable? You don't have anything to give away. What are you going to do? Steal from somebody and give away? Now you're a thief? Right? You've broken the commandment. You're now, right? No, God entrusts you with physical stuff so that you can manifest in this physical world the spiritual love that God has put into your heart. You get a chance to participate in God meeting needs. Now, in the Bible, God clearly gives commands to 5 groups: individuals, families, business, church, and government. There are commands for individuals to take care of the poor. The family commands are mostly relational. Husbands, love your wives. Children, submit to your parents. There is a command that says, take care of your relative or you're worse than an infidel. Business commands are mostly do an honest day's work, don't hold back wages. There is a command that says, leave the gleanings of the field for the poor people to pick through. There definitely are commands for the church to take care of the poor. And immediately the church took care of the orphans and the widows, right? And then the church through history started hospitals. I wrote a whole thing. I did a book on the whole history of hospitals. It all goes back to Christians, right? Muhammad didn't start hospitals. Islam. In India, they have the caste system, and if you're in that lowest class as an untouchable, it's because you did something bad in the past life, and they want to let you suffer really good so you can be reincarnated better in the next life. So there's no motivation to take care of the poor and doctor them up, right? In China, they had 5,000 years of emperors. There's no motivation for an emperor to want to take care of the poor. Right? Atheistic countries, your worth is depend on your utility. If you can contribute to the state, you're worth more. If you're drained on the state, we don't want you. It was Jesus who said, whatever you do to the least of these, my brethren, you've done unto me. And the parable of Good Samaritan, take care of the poor guy that got beat up, pouring oil wine, take him to an inn, I'll pay you more when I get back. And so the Christians started hospitals. Sort of interesting, they would go on pilgrimage to the Holy Land, and they would show up worn out. And so the decision was made that every cathedral where they were making a pilgrimage to, that they would have an infirmary. And they called the infirmary, well, let me say this. The word in Latin for traveler or pilgrim was hosp, H-O-S-P. You get the word, where you get the word hospitality, right? And so they called it a hospital. Hospitals started with Christians taking care of those. And then there was the plague of Justinian in 451 AD, and 15 million people die. And there's St. Samson the Hospitable in Constantinople, and he starts taking the poor into his house and doctoring them up. And then I go through the Middle Ages, the bubonic plague, right? The China, they get this disease came from China. Isn't that interesting? And it gets into fleas, it gets on camels, comes across to the Middle East, gets on rats, gets off ships in Constantinople. And in 1347, 75 million people die. Nobody wanted, they were throwing the dead bodies in the streets. And so a Christian group called the Election Brothers, named after St. Alexis, who gave away his money to help the poor, these Election Brothers go into the streets and collect the dead bodies, give them a Christian burial. If they're not dead yet, they take care of them, sort of do hospice. And then every now and then they recover, right? They start hospitals. And then the first medical school in Western civilization was the Benedictine Catholic order in the 9th century. They started the medical school in their monastery, and then their monastery started having infirmaries, and then you had the Sisters of Charity. So there's a guy named Vincent de Paul. He's captured by the Muslims. He's made a slave, and he's witnessing to one of his master's wives, and she believes, and she goes and nags her husband. And after a while, he lets Vincent de Paul escape. He goes back to Europe. He raises money to ransom back those that have been captured into Muslim slavery, and he starts hospitals. And the Queen of France gives him a lot of money, and so it starts a whole order of Sisters of Charity of St. Vincent de Paul. And they staff all these hospitals. The oldest hospital in Europe that's still there was started in 660 AD, staffed by the Sisters of Charity of St. Vincent de Paul, and it's the Hotel Dieu in Paris. It is right next to Notre Dame Cathedral. It's still there. And anyway, I go through the whole history. But here they're telling Christian medical professionals, give up your conscience and just do the transgendered or abortion or youth or whatever they're telling you. Yet it's that Christian conscience that invented hospitals, that invented medical care for the, right? It wasn't the Egyptians. Medical care was only for the royalty, or it wasn't the Greeks. And by the way, their medical care was getting high on something and letting snakes crawl across you. I mean, it was the Christians. And I totally got off track, but I hope you enjoyed that. Anyway, so God gives commands to 5 groups: individuals, families, business, church. That's where I was at. Church did all that. Did you know there's no command for the government to take care of the poor? The command to the government is the shortest: protect the innocent, punish the guilty. There is no command for the government to get involved in education. There is no command for the government to be involved in health care. What's happened is the government has usurped the church's role. And I thought this was interesting. James Madison said charity is no part of the legislative duty of the government. Here's Representative Davy Crockett. He died in the Alamo. And there was a lady who helped a lot of people in D.C. and her house burnt down, so they were wanting to do an act of Congress to give her money. And Davy Crockett says this: Congress has not the power to appropriate money as an act of charity. Every member on this floor knows it. We have the right as individuals to give away as much of our own money as we please in charity. But as members of Congress, we have no right to appropriate a dollar of the public money as charity. And so, but we need to take care of the poor. We need medical care. We need to do all this. Yes, we do, but it's not the government's job. Calvin Coolidge says this: it does not follow that because something ought to be done, the national government ought to do it. And Gerald Ford put it this way: people say, why don't you expand that program and spend more federal money? I look them in the eye and say, do you realize that a government big enough to give us everything we want is big enough to take away from us everything we have? That's the hook. The little fish: oh, free food, free clothes, free health care, free education, free, and they're wanting to get it. But they say, wait a second, they've got to take away everything. And once that government's big enough to take care of all your free stuff, it's going to be big enough to control your life, and you're going to backdoor back into a totalitarian dictatorship. Now, when the church helps anybody, the church wants that person to get better off. Why? So they can help the next needy person that comes along. It is called disinterested benevolence. And whenever the government helps anybody, it's always in exchange for something. Right? You're in Egypt, you need food. The government gives you food, but it's in exchange for your cattle, your land, your children, your lives, your votes, control. There's a saying: whoever controls the purse strings has the power. So, okay, everybody's equal, but somebody has to decide who lives in the nice house and who lives in the dumpy house. Well, who dictates those things? Oh, somebody in the government dictates. Well, whoever dictates those things is the dictator. Right? So the person that's in the government position that's doing the doling out, he likes his job. And he's going to be tempted to want to give a little extra to those that support him and to hold back those that want to kick him out of his job. Becomes discretionary. Now, when the church helps, the giver experiences the joy of the Lord of being used to help someone in need. The recipient experiences the love of God through a real person and is grateful to God. And a relationship is established, and the body of Christ gets knit together. Whenever the government helps anybody, it is always impersonal. You get that check from the government, you don't know all the people that money came from. There's no relationship. And the recipient goes from being grateful to viewing it as a debt that is owed to them. And if it gets interrupted and it's late, they get irate. And then an interesting phenomenon: when somebody receives free stuff long enough, it hurts their self-esteem. They see other people working and being successful, and they think, and they want to channel that negative feeling somewhere and blame somebody for it, and they end up blaming the entity that is making them feel bad, the very government giving them free stuff. They end up hating the very government that's giving them free stuff. Now, the Pilgrims. We talked about how they were a company colony. They scrapped it, and they gave everybody their own plot of land. It became very industrious, and it worked. So what did they do? They switched from company to covenant. What's the difference? Involuntary to voluntary. So in other words, they're taking care of the poor, not because the bylaws say we're going to take away your stuff and we're going to redistribute it. They're taking care of the poor because they're blessed by God, and God's law says, whatever you do to the least of these, my brethren, you've done unto me. And so you're voluntarily moved upon to give away and help them. So the poor get helped. One way it's forced, impersonal. The other way it's voluntary, and it's motivated by love. So the Pilgrims have what's called a covenant form of government. You get rights and blessings from God. You're committed to caring for each other. Why? Because you're accountable to God. And the Pilgrims were really into this. This came from ancient Israel. And so from the Reformation, 1517, to the Age of Enlightenment in the early 1600s, you have a century where the scholars in Europe are not just excited that they can read the Bible in their own language, German, English, whatever. They're studying the Bible. What part of the Bible? That first 400-year period when Israel came out of Egypt. It's called the Hebrew Republic. It's before King Saul. And so this is unique on planet Earth that we really don't appreciate until we study all the rest of the world's history and realize that here, in 1400 BC, the Israelites come out of Egypt. For 400 years, no king. It's a total anomaly in world's history. And so the Christians that studied this period were called Christian Hebraists because they studied the Hebrew. They were mostly Puritans. And they were so good that later rabbis were quoting from these Christian Hebraists. And the period they studied before King Saul is called the Hebrew Republic. And they actually taught Hebrew at Harvard and Yale. This is Yale coat of arms. They still have Hebrew characters on it to this day. So the Hebrew Republic, this is that first 400-year period. Everyone's equal. There's no king. There's nobody to butter up next to. I mean, everybody I see is equal to me. Yeah, there's no royal family to butter up next to. And the law specifically says there is no respect of persons in judgment. Rich or poor, everyone's the same. Male, female, no matter what race you are. It's the beginning of the concept of equality on planet Earth is ancient Israel. And they have the idea of tolerance. Here they were worshiping the one true God, and they never felt compelled to force anyone to convert and be a Jew. And get your lamb and drag it to the temple. No, if you wanted to convert, you did, but they didn't go out there. It wasn't like, Nebuchadnezzar, when I blow my trumpet, you bow. No, they didn't do that. Israel was the first nation in world history with private land ownership. You think, really? Yeah. Wherever there's a king, you never really own the land. It is always going to be conditional of you staying on the nice side of the king. You cross the king, he will take away the land and kill you. In ancient Israel, the land was permanently titled to each family. Israel had no police. Everyone was taught the law. Everyone helped enforce the law. It was like everybody was deputized. We have a little of that today with traffic laws. Somebody cuts you off, you take it upon yourself to honk the horn, right? Or maybe a mom watching a bunch of neighborhood kids. She has no problem correcting somebody else's kid. So in ancient Israel, everybody corrected everybody else. If you heard your neighbor take God's name in vain, it was your job to go to the elders and say, I heard it, right? And ancient Israel, the children were taught the law. And there's, Genesis, and God chose Abraham because he knew he would teach his children to do the ways of the Lord, to do justice and judgment, teach your children and so forth. And ancient Israel was the first nation with no standing army. You have a king, he has an army always at hand to enforce his will. In ancient Israel, every man was in the militia and armed with a sword upon their thigh, and they were ready at a moment's notice to defend their family and their community. Ancient Israel had no prisons. Joseph in Egypt was in prison for several years. In Israel, when a crime was committed, you immediately got the accused and brought him to the elders at the gates of the city, and you had the trial. Israel had a bureaucracy-free welfare system. What's that? In Egypt, you need food. The government gives you food, but it's in exchange for all your freedoms. In Israel, when you harvested your field, you left the gleanings for the poor people to pick through, like Ruth. This way, the poor were taken care of on a decentralized, cellular level, so to speak, without some political leader collecting everything and being tempted to dole it back out as favors to those that can keep him in power. Israel had a system of honesty. God hates unjust weights and measures, became the basis for commerce, and Israel got to choose their own leaders. Moses spake unto the children of Israel, how can I alone bear your burden? Take you, wise men, and understanding, and known among your tribes, and I'll make them rulers over you. This was an election process. You know the people that hate covetousness, they're honest. So anybody in ancient Israel could be raised up into leadership. Gideon, here's a woman, Deborah. She's not royalty. She's not related to a king. It's just, she knows the law. She's honest. The reputation spreads. And she sits under a tree. People make their way all the way across the country to have her tell them what the law says. Where else in the world could a woman become a national leader that's not related to royalty? So Harvard President Samuel Langdon gave a speech. He says, the Israelites may be considered as a pattern to the world in all ages of government on Republican principles. From abject slavery, a mere mob, to a well-regulated nation under laws far superior to what any other nation could boast. And anyway, ancient Israel was the first nation that could read. And anyway, I go through all that, but I'm sort of wanting to jump ahead. This is interesting. So power, you got one side total government, the other side no government. Total government, you get a king who rules through fear. No government's anarchy unless everybody is taught the law. I was trying to think of a way of explaining it. It's like everybody downloads a behavioral app on their iPhone. So we all got phones with GPS, tells you where to turn. Imagine an app that tells you how to act in real time. Don't steal, right? Don't lose your temper at somebody. And the Levite priests were the computer geeks that help you to download the app, right? And so in ancient Israel, everybody had the app, right? You got the app, I got the app. Everybody had the law memorized. And but the question is, why would you follow it? What would motivate you to follow an internal moral? They had the chief ingredient. There's a God who's watching everyone. He wants you to be fair. He's going to hold you accountable in the future. You're about to steal. Nobody's around. And then you think, God's watching me. He wants me to be fair. He's going to hold me accountable. Maybe I should hesitate stealing. Create something in your head called the conscience. If everybody in the country really, truly believes this, you can maintain complete order with no police, right? Now, God knew the Israelites would sin, so once a year they had the Day of Atonement, and everyone's sins in the whole nation were forgiven, and they started the new year off with a clean slate. Obviously, this is pointing to Jesus. Ronald Reagan says, without God, there's no virtue because there's no prompting of the conscience. Without God, behind the laws are just things made up by some old men. Why follow them? Some will as long as it's the end thing to do. Others are going to say, forget this. They're going to start robbing and stealing. It's going to turn into lawlessness and chaos, and that's when it all falls apart. Ancient Israel, when the priest stopped teaching the law, it fell apart. So you got high priest Eli, his own sons are sleeping with women in the very tent where the Ark of the Covenant is. He's not teaching the law. Another Levite with a silver graven image, and the law says you're not supposed to have graven images, and then a Levite with a concubine. The law says the Levite's to marry a virgin of his own tribe, so he's not following the law, and the poor girl is raped by sodomites. Remember J.D. Unwin said, unrestrained sexual promiscuity always precedes the destruction of a civilization. So here's ancient Israel. Sounds like it's free, anything goes sexually, and it turns into chaos. And they all go, every man does what is right in their own eyes. Same quote that Plato had, but Israel was before Plato. So Israel was back probably around 1100 BC, but then Plato was 380 BC. And turns into an unstructured chaos. And so what do? They all go to Samuel the prophet, and they say this self-government system's not working. We want to be like the other countries. We want a king. And Samuel cries, and the Lord said, they didn't reject you, they rejected me. So Israel, power taken away from the people, the rubber band snaps back, they get a king. And Saul turns into a tyrant and kills all the whole bunch of the priests. And the study of socialism. We talked about Plato and Sir Thomas More, Sir Francis Bacon. We talked about the pilgrims that tried it and they scrapped it. We talked about ancient Israel, that it worked as a covenant voluntarily. But now we're going to talk about the French Revolution. And now we're bringing it a little bit closer to the present. And we had a revolution, and France helped us. Do you know what France got in return for helping us? Nothing but debt. And then their crops failed. And the people didn't have bread. Remember they went to Queen Marie Antoinette and they said, the people don't have bread. And she said, let them eat cake. I mean, it wasn't her fault. She just grew up in court. But anyway, the people of France said, if we can just chop off the king and queen's heads, all of our problems will be solved. Well, they did. It doesn't get any better. So then they chop off the heads of all the royalty. Doesn't get any better. Then they chop off the heads of all the wealthy. You got money, we don't, you're selfish. Then they chop off the heads of the businessmen and farmers. You got food and supplies, we don't, you're selfish. And then they chop off the heads of the hoarders. You got extra food, I don't have enough, you're selfish. Then they chop off the heads of the clergy, because they're speaking out against the head chopping off stuff. And then they chop off the heads of the former revolutionaries, the ones that used to chop off heads but got tired of it, somehow they're to blame. 30,000 people had their heads chopped off in Paris, France. They're chopping them off so fast that they said, we need a new invention. And so they invented the guillotine. Nice, clean head chopping off, right? And so the motto of the French Revolution was liberty, equality, fraternity. Fraternity was their word for socialism. The fraternity, the group, the collective, the mob, right? The social state. And equality can be understood two ways. In America, equality was equal treatment before the law. In France, it was everyone having an equal amount of stuff. And if the fraternité, the group, the collective, the socialist state thinks you have too much stuff, it can take away your stuff, redistribute it, and kill you. And so Harvard president Samuel Langdon said, 1728, Voltaire, and anyway, he starts basically tearing down Christian morals, and they, again, turn into sexual immorality, and the whole thing falls apart. Now, I thought this was interesting. They tore down statues during the French Revolution. The statue of good King Henry IV, right? He was trying to patch up Protestants and Catholics. They tore it down. Then they dug up the grave of St. Genevieve. Who is she? During Attila the Hun scourging Europe, she gets all of Paris to fast and pray, and Attila skips sacking Paris. So she's the patron saint of Paris. During the French Revolution, they dig up her bones and trash them. Why would they do that? It's a concept called deconstruction. And every government that takes over a country tends to do this. It's where you portray the founders of a country negatively, so the people emotionally detach from them, then you get them into a neutral position where they're open-minded, and then you portray whatever future you have planned for them positively. It's a sales technique. If I was a toothpaste salesman, the first thing I do is I tell you negative things about the toothpaste you are currently brushing with. You're still brushing with that stuff? Haven't you read that it'll eat the enamel off your teeth? You're like, ooh, really? You're repulsed by it. Now I got you in a neutral position. You're open-minded with all the toothpaste out there. Then I give you my pitch for this brand new tartar-controlled breath freshener toothpaste, right? So that's what they do. They go into the classrooms and they tell the kids negative things about the founding fathers. They took land from Indians. They were, they sold people into slavery. They were chauvinists. Ooh, the students are repulsed by them. Now you got the kids in a neutral. They're open-minded. What are all the belief systems out there? Then you give them your pitch for socialism or LGBT or radical Islam. And Europe went through this. Europe went from 1,000 years of Catholic cathedrals, Protestant Reformation, Jewish neighborhoods, to the secular French Revolution. And it was free sex, anything goes, and now it's turning into a Sharia socialist Europe with Muhammad being the #1 name for newborns. But it's not just Western civilization. China, 3rd century BC, the Warring States period. Half-dozen kingdoms fighting, and one wins, led by Qin Shi Huangdi. He's considered the first one to unify China, and he's doing things differently than they had been done for centuries before. And he got tired of being criticized for doing things differently than they had been done before. So he decided to destroy all records of how things were done before. And he burnt tens of thousands of bamboo annal books. They wrote on strips of bamboo from top to bottom, wove them together, burning them all. And his chancellor was Li Si, who wrote in 213 BC, I, your servant, propose that all historians' records other than those of Quin's be burned. If anyone under heaven has copies of the classics of history, they shall deliver them to the governor for burning. Anyone who dares discuss the classics of history shall be publicly executed. Anyone who uses history to criticize the present shall have his family executed. And anyone who's failed to burn the books after 30 days of this announcement shall be sent to build the Great Wall. This inspired Mao Zedong in the 1960s, a cultural revolution where he destroyed thousands of years of Chinese history. Why? So that he could have this mass of young people that he could brainwash into the People's Republic of China. And they would do shaming. All the doctors and lawyers and teachers, they would bring them in and confess their whiteness. They would confess that they were part of the evil Western capitalist system, right? and they would kill them. And they destroyed the oldest Buddhist temple in China. They destroyed the old Great Gates of Beijing. It was an intentional effort to destroy the history. And this was a recent article. Xi Jinping of China ordering erasure of Genghis Khan from Chinese history. Genghis Khan was Mongolian, conquered China, the Yuan dynasty, for 100 years. But it's considered an embarrassment to the pure Chinese that this Mongolian. And so here Paris was going to have a Genghis Khan exhibition, and the president of China calls Paris and says, cancel it, right? So Pol Pot did the same thing in Cambodia. He wanted to erase history, so he made 1975 the new year 1 and killed anybody that wore glasses. He says if you wore glasses, you could read. If you read, you knew the history, and he wanted to destroy history. He killed a third of his country. And radical Muslims do this. Whenever they come into a city, they destroy statues and histories and libraries and artwork and churches and museums and graves and rename everything with Arabic names. And the oldest library in the world was in Alexandria, Egypt. And Amir Ibn al-As comes in and conquers Egypt, and they come to this library, and they don't know what to do with all these books. And so they sent a message to Caliph Umar. And he supposedly said, every book that does not agree with the Quran, destroy. And every book that does agree with the Quran is redundant. So destroy them all. It took 6 months to burn them all. And then in around 832 AD, there's another sultan, and he sees these pyramids with tunnels that hit a stone wall. He says, nobody builds a tunnel to a stone wall. There's got to be something behind it. He has his men light a fire in front of the stone wall and lets it burn for weeks, and it weakens the stone. They crack through it, they see all this gold, so he starts to do it to and they trash all that pagan, ancient Egyptian stuff, and they view that anything before Islam is bad. And so they're still doing it. But in America, it's called the 1619 Project, and Howard Zinn's People's History of the United States, and so forth. Carl Sandburg said, when a nation goes down, one condition may always be found: they forgot where they came from. So America's founders were humans. They made mistakes, but they gave you a present. And that present is you get to be the king of your life and decide that you want to be here tonight. And you decide who you want to marry and where you want to live, what career you want to pursue, and what food you want to eat. You can eat pork if you want. You decide how you dress. You don't have to wear a burqa if you don't want. You get to be in charge of your life, and all of us together are in charge of the country. It's a bottom-up form of government. Yeah? I mean, it's like if there's somebody that maybe they didn't always live a perfect life, and somehow or another they got really rich, and they decided they wanted to give you $1 million. Would you like say, you viewed pornography one time, so I'm not going to take your money? Would you do that? You're like, I'm going to take your money and I'll pray for you, right? The Founding Fathers gave you a present, and that present is you get to be in charge of your life, and all of us together are in charge of the country. And so France, they do all this head chopping off stuff. They want to erase Christian heritage. They destroy religious monuments, desecrate graves, religious meetings, churches closed. And remember those nuns that ran hospitals? They lined them up and chopped off their heads. I mean, it's sort of like today where the government was suing these little sisters of charity because they didn't want to pay for abortions because they take vows of chastity, but and so here the government was going after saying, you got to deny your Christian faith that's created hospitals in the first place, and they wouldn't. And they're singing their church song. And one by one, they got their heads chopped off. One less person singing, one less person, until finally no more singing. And priests and ministers and those who harbored them were executed on sight. A similar thing happened in Mexico in 1917 with President Calles. And then there's a rural area. It's country, farmlands, way far away from the capital. They think they're safe, but all of a sudden, a secular federal army shows up, and they kill 300,000 men, women, and children in the Vendee. It's considered the first modern genocide. And it became a model for every socialist revolution since, that it's okay to kill off the old order so that you can do something new and wonderful. But what happens? Democracy and republics without the people having morals and virtue turns into lawlessness and chaos, out of which a dictator rises. What happened in France? They had their democracy and their republic. They didn't have morals and virtue. It turns into chaos, and out of that chaos came Napoleon. And he seized power, put his own crown on his head, right? During the French Revolution, Robespierre puts a prostitute in Notre Dame Cathedral, covers her with a sheet, calls her the goddess of reason. They didn't want done in the year of the Lord. They made 1792 the new year 1. They didn't like a 7-day week because it went back to the Bible. So they came up with a 10-day week called the decade week. Each day had 10 hours. Each hour had 100 minutes. Each minute had 100 seconds. It's called French Republic time, and they used it for 15 years. And they made every measurement in France divisible by 10 because you count with 10 fingers. So they said 10 was the number of man, and they called it the metric system. Maybe that's why I never really liked the metric system. And so in this French Revolution, there's no God. It's just the mob, the fraternity, the group, the collective that decides what's called the social contract, what everybody agrees upon, but the mob is what, and so then you get your Napoleon dictator. And now Napoleon conquers Europe, kills 6 million people, and afterwards the King of Prussia says, we can't get conquered that easy again, we need to strengthen the state, and he gets a philosopher named Hegel, and I'll tell you about him in a minute. But we go through 4 stages. And this, I thought this was sort of fascinating. We go from Pilgrim Covenant, where you get rights and blessings from God, and you covenant to take care of people voluntarily. Why? Because you're accountable to God. In the century after the Pilgrims, covenant turns into social contract. And it's impersonal. And it's just agreeing with people, and if God exists, he's distant, far removed, impersonal. This comes out of the scientific revolution, where Sir Isaac Newton discovers there's laws of gravity, laws of optics. Kepler discovers laws of planetary motion. Robert Boyle discovers laws of pressure. And so some theologians say, well, maybe God made everything with laws. And like a guy makes a clock and winds it up and sets it on a shelf, everything's just going on its own. And if God's there, he's far removed. He's distant. Don't even bother praying because things are just following these rules. In the next century, social contract with an impersonal God turns into the French Revolution, which is social contract with no God. You get your rights from the group, you're accountable to the group. And in the next century, it turned into Marxism and socialism, where the state is God. You get your rights from the state, you're accountable to the state, and the state can kill you if it doesn't think. Matter of fact, Hegel, this German philosopher at the University of Berlin, said the state is God walking on earth. We must worship the state. All the worth which the human being possesses, he possesses only through the state. There's no God that you're made in the image of. Rousseau, who wrote The Social Contract, says, when the state says to a citizen, it is expedient for the state that you should die, he ought to die, because his life is a gift made conditionally by the state. 100 years later in Germany, the Nazi Ministry of Justice authorized physicians to end the sufferings of incurable patients. No life still valuable to the state will be wantonly destroyed. And then you got Pol Pot in Cambodia, remember him? He said, to keep you is no benefit, to destroy you is no loss. In other words, if you benefit me, I'll keep you alive, but if you're not benefiting me, it's no loss, I just kill you. And so we go through these 4 stages: Pilgrim Covenant, under God; Age of Enlightenment, social contract with a distant God; French Revolution, social contract with no God; to socialism, Marxism, where the state is God. And Hegel said the state recognizes no authority but its own. It acknowledges no abstract rules of good and bad. What's an abstract rule of good and bad? You mean like the 10 Commandments? Yeah, there's no God. It's just what the state agrees upon. And Eisenhower said this: in many lands, the state claims to be the author of human rights. If the state gives rights, it can and inevitably will take away those rights. The Founding Fathers had to refer to the Creator in order to make their revolutionary experiment make sense. In other words, do your rights come from the government or from a source higher than the government? If there's no God, your rights come from the government, and what the government giveth, the government can taketh awayeth. But our founders believed the rights came from a creator. The government's job is to protect our creator-given rights. Eisenhower, it was because all men are endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights that we could dare to be free. The king was infringing on our God-given rights, so we rebelled. So, self-government. We talked about how in times of panic and fear, people will trade their freedom for security. And we talked about how that people will trade their freedom for dependency, right, for free stuff. And it's sort of a natural phenomenon. And some politicians have noticed it, and they want to speed it along by intentionally creating crises. And how am I doing? Do I still have your attention? Okay. So the idea is that you speed it along by creating or capitalizing on discord and chaos to consolidate control. Did you know the Bible, Psalms 133, God loves unity? How good and pleasant it is for brethren to dwell together in unity. And God hates discord. Proverbs 6, the Lord hates, 6 things the Lord hates, yea, 7 are an abomination: proud look, lying tongue, hand swift to shedding innocent blood. And the last is he that soweth discord amongst the brethren. So we got unity, we got discord. Could imagine being in heaven and somebody sowing discord in heaven? It was Lucifer. He got a third of the angels to be discontent with God and to rebel against God. And so we see this manifested on earth. So here we have Gideon defeats 100,000 Midianites. There is no threat to Israel, and they're at peace. But he has an illegitimate son named Abimelech who decides to sow discord. He goes to Shechem, and he is the first one to do identity politics. He says, why should the sons of Gideon reign over you? Remember, I am your bone and your flesh. And they said, well, we got to vote for Abimelech because he is our brother. And so he gets them to sow discord, and he goes to the temple of Baal-berith, and he takes 70 pieces of silver out of the treasury, 70 pieces, and he hires rioters. All right, like Antifa, and it says, wherewith Abimelech hired vain and worthless persons which followed him, and he went into his father's house at Ophrah and slew his brethren. They're committing violence. And the men of Shechem made Abimelech king. And this would have been the end of the republic of the Hebrew Republic 100 years before Saul had not somebody threw a millstone over a wall and killed Abimelech. And so he sowed discord. And then we have Machiavelli. 500 years ago, Italy was a bunch of city-states that fought. Venice, Genoa, Naples, Florence, Siena. And Machiavelli thought if one prince could control all of the city-states, it would stop the infighting. So he had a good end. And so he wrote a book called The Prince, where he advocates the ends justifies the means. The end of one prince controlling all of Italy is such a good end, because it'll stop the infighting, that any means necessary to get there is justified. Lie, cheat, steal. So if a prince conquers a city, and the city does not want to be conquered, they will hate him. But if the prince pays criminals, like Abimelech did, to kill cows, burn barns, smash windows, the people will panic in fear, and they will trade their freedom for security. They'll beg for help, and the prince will come in. Like a governor, we need somebody to come along, and he'll come in and get rid of the very criminals he bribed to create the problem. Nobody will know the better for it, and everyone will praise the prince as a hero. So it's good marketing. You create the need and fill it. You go around the back of the house, set it on fire, then you go around the front of the house and sell them a fire extinguisher. And they'll pay anything for it and even thank you for being there. So it's called Machiavellianism, where you create or capitalize on a crisis to consolidate control. You know this quote a little bit better like this: you never want a serious crisis to go to waste. It is an opportunity to do things that you think you could not do before. Rahm Emanuel. Or Secretary of State Clinton said, an old friend of mine and my husband said, never waste a good crisis. So you and I see a crisis. Our response is, how can we help people through it? Ambitious politicians see a crisis. Their response is, how can we usurp rights and freedoms away from people while they're fearful and take over? Now, we talked about Abimelech, hiring vain and worthless persons. We talked about Machiavelli, and now we're back to Hegel. Hegel, you know how Germans like to make things really organized, and so he took all this and put it into a triangle. It's called Hegelian dialectics. And one corner of a triangle is a thesis, the opposite is the antithesis, and the top corner is a synthesis. Sounds complicated, but it's not. Now, he influenced Darwin, who used this to come up with his theory of evolution, and he influenced a student there named Karl Marx. Karl Marx was a young Hegelian at the University of Berlin. So Marx takes this Hegelian dialectics, thesis, antithesis, synthesis, applies it to politics and says, okay, the thesis is the status quo in a country. You have to create discord. You have to create a problem that's real bad, and then everybody's happy to settle for your answer that's half as bad. And then that becomes the new starting point thesis. You create another problem that's real bad, and everybody's happy to settle for your answer that's half as bad. Then you create another problem that's real bad, and everybody's happy to settle for your answer that's half as bad. You do this over and over again, and each time they settle, the people give up a little more of their individual rights and freedoms to the state. And now, how do you create a problem that's real bad? Karl Marx called it critical theory. He says you send in agitators, agent provocateurs, community organizers, labor organizers. Their job is to stir up dissension. And when it gets really bad, everybody panics and says, we need some governor to come along and fix this mess. And they let go of their freedoms. And so He would organize the proletariat against the bourgeois, so it was called critical economic theory. And then they would organize the poor against the rich, blacks against the whites, Catholics against the Protestants, Muslims against Christians, Hutus against the Tutsis in the Congo and Rwanda. Really don't care who the two sides are, really don't care what the issues are. Their goal is to create a destabilizing crisis that makes everybody in the country panic and fearful, and they're willing to trade freedom for security. And how did it come to America? Well, 1894, you had a Pullman Railroad car company in Chicago, downturn in the economy, they couldn't pay everybody, and so Eugene Debs organizes these disgruntled people to riot. And they burn $80 million worth of railroad cars in 27 states. This rioting went all across the country. Could you imagine rioting just sort of going all across the country? And the railroad stopped, so there's no mail, there's no products being delivered. I mean, the country is frozen. And so after this, Eugene Debs starts the Socialist Party of America. And he runs for president 5 times from 1900 to 1920, 1 time from prison. You know Eugene Debs because there was a former presidential candidate that had his picture on the wall of his office, right? Somebody from Delaware, Vermont, I don't know. And so in 1920, branching off of the Socialist Party USA was the Communist Party USA. And they ran candidates for president every year from 1920 to 1940. What happened in 1940? Democrat President Franklin Roosevelt makes a treaty with Stalin, Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, and they said, why should we run our own candidates? Here we have a candidate in a particular party that's making treaties with the Soviet Union. So from that point on, the Democrat Party was supported by the communists. And it changed the party. Ronald Reagan said, I didn't leave the Democrat Party left me. Zell Miller, I met him. He was the last pro-life Democrat senator. And he says that he basically got kicked out by the time it was done because they'd take over the party. Now let's look at Germany. 1920s Germany is a republic. The people are in charge. They're climbing out of the post-war troubles. And somebody starts a party. His name's Hitler. And the party is the National Socialist Workers' Party. And what's the difference between the Soviet Union and the National Socialists? Soviet Union, they're willing to make the whole world socialist, right? The Nazis, they think that the Aryan race, the national, was superior. They're still both socialists. They're just different flavors of socialist. And so Hitler's National Socialist Workers' Party had a violent arm to it, very similar to Abimelech hiring rioters, Machiavelli's Prince hiring rioters, and his rioters were called brown shirts. And they were nicknamed Sturmabteilung, which means stormtroopers. And they would storm into the meetings of Hitler's opponents and shout down the speakers and disrupt the meeting. And then they would lock arms and block buildings and block streets. Could you imagine people locking arms and blocking streets and things, And then they went into the cities and they set buildings on fire downtown, right? 7,500 stores had their windows smashed. It's the night of broken glass, Kristallnacht. And they were looted and set on fire. They were owned by Jews. And then, so all these inner cities are just being burnt up by these brown shirts, and then their capital gets attacked, right? The Reichstag. And in the confusion, Hitler blames his innocent political opponents for the problem and has them hunt down. You got into the Capitol. And he has them deplatformed and arrested and silenced and put in jail and has them shot without a trial. And when the dust settles, Hitler had no political opponents, and Germany transitioned from a republic to a dictatorship, right? His group created, like Abimelech, creating the problems, like Machiavelli, right? They created the problems, and then the people want an answer, and he comes in, and he seizes power. And anyway. So, after World War II, Germany, France, England give up their colonies. So India becomes a brand new country. Egypt, Israel, Albania, Romania, Poland, Hungary, Lithuania, all these countries brand new with brand new leaders. And they're climbing out of the post-World War II crisis, and it looks hopeful, except there's a debate in the Soviet Union. Should communism run the Soviet Union or run the world? And the world side, so they decided to send communist KGB agents into all these countries, and they did critical theory. What's that? Observe the country and break them into groups. Ethnically, Bosnian, Croats, Serbs, religiously, Sunni, Shia, Orthodox, racially, economically, it did not matter. They would break them into groups of victims and oppressors, haves and have-nots. And then they would organize protests that they would escalate into riots and violence and bloodshed. Why? Because once blood is shed, people no longer think rationally, they think emotionally, and then they can be manipulated easier. It's called fear-mongering and race-baiting. And then they would co-opt the media with bribes and threats to blame the new leader of the new country for all of the problems. And then they would nurture weak links in the military. And when the country gets confused and panicky enough at all the violence, they do a coup or a rigged election and replace the leader with a Soviet puppet. And the violence suddenly stops, and everybody breathes a sigh of relief until they realize they just gave up the farm, and now they're ruled by a Soviet puppet dictator. 45 countries fell to this, and it's called Behind the Iron Curtain. Latvia, Lithuania, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, all these countries, and Behind the Iron Curtain. Truman does nothing. He thinks the United Nations that he helped form will bring world peace, but Eisenhower is the next president. Eisenhower says, the United Nations seems to be two distinct things to the two worlds divided by the Iron Curtain. To the free world, it seems the United Nations should be a constructive forum. To the communist world, it has been a sounding board for their propaganda, a weapon to be exploited in spreading disunity and confusion. Discord, right? And so Eisenhower can do nothing and let these countries fall to the communists, or he can fight fire with fire, and that's what he does. Iran sides with the Soviet Union, and they nationalize their oil industry. And you say, big deal. Well, wait a second. Britain has no oil fields. So in 1908, Britain formed the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. You know it better as BP. And so when Britain has no oil, they appeal to Eisenhower for help. And Eisenhower approves the first CIA operation to overthrow a country's leader. It's Operation Ajax. The CIA operative on the ground is Kermit Roosevelt Jr., the grandson of Teddy Roosevelt. He's an expert in foreign languages, goes to Tehran, and he does the same thing in reverse. He recruits mobsters and gangsters and radical imams, and they stage protests and riots, and they attack mosques, and they co-opt the media with bribes and threats to blame Mossadegh for all of the problems. And when everybody is confused enough, they put Mossadegh under house arrest, lock him away for the rest of his life where he dies, and they replace him with the Shah, who loved America and had rightful claim to the throne. And the CIA did the same thing in Guatemala, 1954, and the Congo, 1960, Dominican Republic, South Vietnam, Brazil, Chile, and the KGB did the same thing, with Brezhnev helping Yasser Arafat to start the PLO and bring division in the Middle East, and Brezhnev helping Castro to sow division and take over Cuba, and the Soviets having coups and coup attempts in Latin South America, and hundreds of coup attempts in Africa, and then China did the same thing in the Far East. This is called the Cold War. And these tactics have been perfected and perfected and perfected. Chris Matthews, in his last TV appearance, he said, I remember the Cold War. I've seen what socialism is like, and I don't like it, okay? It's not only not free, it doesn't work. I believe that if Castro and the Reds had won, there would have been executions in Central Park. And right after this, Chris Matthews was fired. Now, he says executions in Central Park. Do you know who his executioner was? Che Guevara. And Che Guevara wrote this: we executed many people by firing squad without knowing if they were fully guilty. I'd like to confess, I discovered that I really like killing. Che Guevara, blind hate against the enemy, creates a forceful impulse that cracks the boundaries of natural human limitations, transforming the soldier into an effective, selective, cold killing machine that people without hate cannot triumph. Right? And so this is an intentional thing of stirring it, where Jesus said what? You forgive. Right? Now, Karl Marx and Frederick Engels wrote the Communist Manifesto, and they also wrote this, that they were alchemists of the revolution. Their business consists in spurring it into artificial crises. And every new crisis must be more serious and universal than the last. Every fresh slump must ruin more small capitalists. This will increase the number of the unemployed, and in the end, commercial crises will lead to a social revolution. And so in 1934, same time Stalin's taken over, right, in Russia, this appeared in the Chicago Tribune. It says, plan of action for U.S., spend, 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 under the guise of recovery. So we're going to spend this money, it's going to stimulate the economy. No. It says, the goal is to bust the government, blame the capitalists for the failure, junk the Constitution, and declare a dictatorship. And then on the side it says it worked in Russia. So you're spending government money not for the purpose of stimulating the economy. You want to say you want to stimulate, but your real purpose is to bankrupt. It's called the Great Reset. Right? And it's called the Cloward-Piven strategy, where you backdoor a country into socialism by ruining their currency so everybody has to do what? Go to the government and be dependent. And say, government, bail us out. And then they end up getting their checks, and then they end up saying, you want to continue to get your checks? You've got to do this, that, and the other. And so this began to be instituted during, they blamed the Depression on Hoover, and then FDR did this. David Horowitz was a communist who later became a conservative writer, and he says the issue is never the issue is always the revolution. Civil rights, women's rights is never the real cause. Women, blacks are only instruments in the larger cause, which is power. Battles over rights and other issues, according to Alinsky, should never be seen as more than occasions to advance the real agenda, which is the accumulation of power. And the people that think that those issues are the real issues, Lenin called them what? Useful idiots. They think it actually has something to do with whatever the particular thing is. There's a bigger picture, and they're just pawns on a chessboard. And now it's interesting, 1980, a KGB agent defected, and he spilled the beans on their plan. Yuri Bezmenov, he went to India, and he was doing critical theory. He was dividing up all the groups until he realized that some of the groups he was dividing up and identifying that they were being set aside to be killed once that they had a takeover. And he decided to leave and to Greece, finally came to America, and he actually wanted to tell the government, and they weren't too interested. Then he goes to Canada and later comes back. But he says, people think of KGB like James Bond. He goes, no, because our job was a lot more less exciting. We would just observe the society and see the influencers in media, in education, in the pulpit. And our job was to pull them in a socialist direction. And he says, this takes about 20 years. That's how long it takes to re-educate a generation. He says it's so effective that after somebody goes through it, you can take them to the Soviet Union, show them a concentration camp, and they won't believe their own eyes. He says then you destabilize the country. Get them to spend, weaken their infrastructure, weaken their military with maybe pushing a sexual agenda that, when you compare it to what countries like China and everything, they're getting real disciplined and we're, confusing. And then you have said there's a crisis, an incident that you can fan, have it spread across the country and cause this rioting. And in the middle of that panic, you do your coup or your rigged election. And then you have a period of normalization where everybody feels like things are getting back to normal, but you're just getting used to having lost your freedoms. And then they do this again and again, that Hegelian dialectic, And so 1963, Congressman from Florida, Albert Herlong, reads into the congressional record 45 goals for the communists on how to infiltrate. In other words, they couldn't defeat America on the battlefield during a two-front world war, so their response was to rot us from within. And it was called, Antonio Gramsci was a socialist who died in an Italian prison, but he called it the long march through the institutions. He criticized Stalin, says you cannot defeat America with your armies. You have to take a long time and march through the institutions of marriage, family, church, education, and you rot them all from the inside. And he even said, as long as there are Judeo-Christian values, socialism will never take over. Why? Because Judeo-Christian values gives emphasis on the individual. And you need people to give up the individual and associate and identify with a group that can be pitted against other groups to cause this division. So Albert Herlong says, infiltrate the churches and replace revealed religion with social religion. Discredit the Bible. And so one of the people that went through this period of time is Manning Johnson, and he became a communist. In New York, he even ran for Congress as a communist. And after 10 years, he realized that the communists really didn't want to help his people. They just wanted to use his people to sow division. There's even a quote from Malcolm X, and he said the same thing. And anyway, so he leaves. He writes a book called Color, Communism, and Common Sense. And Archibald Roosevelt the son of Teddy Roosevelt, writes the foreword to the book. But amongst other things, he writes this. He says, they tried to do the same thing they did in the Soviet Union, have the people spit on the Bible and kick the Bible. But he says the people in the minority communities were too attached to the Bible. They couldn't get rid of it. So he said they decided to change the gospel. And he says the new line went like this. Jesus, the carpenter, was a worker like the communists. He was against the money changers, the capitalists, the exploiters of the day. This is why he drove them from the temple. Communists are the modern-day fighters against capitalists, the money changers. If Jesus were living today, he would be persecuted like the communists. So forget the fact that we're sinners and a just God deserves to send us to hell, but the just God loves us, and so he provided his own son to die on the cross to pay for all of our sins. Forget the whole gospel thing. Jesus was just an activist. And Alexander Solzhenitsyn gave a warning. I call upon America to be more careful with its trust. Prevent those from falsely using the struggle for social justice to lead you down a false road. A little closer to the present, Saul Alinsky. Why is he important? Hillary Clinton did her senior thesis at Wellesley College on Saul Alinsky, and President Obama was an organizer with the Saul Alinsky group in Chicago. So Saul Alinsky, he was a young man, and he rode around with Al Capone's hitman, Frank Nitti, and saw how all that they had to do was kill a few people, rough up some people, smash a few windows, and the whole neighborhood would get in fear, and they would trade their freedom for security and agree to pay them out protection money so that they could be safe. And so he applied this to politics. And he says that the first step in community organization is community disorganization. Disruption of the present organization is the first step, right? So you take that status quo, that thesis, you have to create disorder. You have to, and he says the organizer's first job is to create the issues or the problems, identify the different groups, right? And the organizer must first rub raw the resentment of the people of the community. The organizer must stir up dissatisfaction and discontent. Fan the latent hostilities of many of the people to the point of overt expression. The organizer polarizes the issue, helps lead his forces into conflict. He must search out controversy, for unless there is controversy, the people are not concerned enough to act. So instead of bringing healing, the idea is you want to pick at the scab, you want to sow disorder, and now Saul Alinsky has an acknowledgement in the front of his book to Lucifer. You can buy a book. I got a copy of this book. Lest we forget, at least an over-the-shoulder acknowledgement to the first radical known to man who rebelled against the establishment and did it so effectively he at least won his own kingdom, Lucifer. This is understood. This is the strategy. Lucifer sowed discord in heaven. The Saul Alinsky method is you do the Abimelech thing, right? There's peace. You want to go in, you want to sow discord. Right? It's the Machiavelli thing. You pay the rioters, right? It's the, and so we see these riotings taking place across the country, and when you look a little deeper, it looks like somebody's organizing them. You know, I speak all across the country. I spoke in Emporia, Kansas, and they said, yeah, they were going to have a peaceful protest here, and a pallet of bricks got dropped off right where they were going to be doing a peaceful protest. And he says, there's no construction in that area. And these reports came from all across the country. There's videos in Dallas, a pallet of bricks is dropped off. There's an immense amount. And the whole NSA was put in place to be able to stop any type of domestic terrorism. It's like, where are those guys? And in some minority communities, they are so Christian, they can't get a spark going. Remember that there was a killing in South Carolina and the people in the black church forgave the killer? And so in areas where they cannot have enough spark to start a fire, they import people that have a predisposition to rioting. And now let's look at the COVID response a little deeper. The first thing was let criminals out of jail. I mean, seriously, who does this? There's no other jail. I mean, you couldn't do something, but they just, boom, let them all out of jail. And then crime goes up. Duh, let criminals out. Didn't think that was going to happen, right? And then some people move out of the big city. Who? Well, maybe those with families, certainly those that can afford to move out. Okay, pro-family people, a little better off. They may belong to one particular political party. Who's left in the city? Well, more people that are dependent on government entitlements. Well, they tend to belong to a different political party. And then COVID response was shut down businesses and stand by and let them get looted and trashed like Crystal Nacht. And so pro-business people move out of the city. Okay, they tend to belong to that first political party. And then churches are shut down where social conservatives gather, and then schools are closed where kids that have been indoctrinated with hate America are let loose so they're free to riot. Net COVID response was more people of one political party leave the big city, leaving the other political party with monopoly control of the city politics. And in presidential election years, whoever wins the big city wins the state. Whoever wins the state gets all the electoral votes for the state, and the president is elected by electoral votes. There is a clear political advantage to one party by letting violence go up in the cities with the COVID response. Anyway, I just thought I'd come and give you a little encouragement tonight, and lift you up. Now, how am I doing time-wise? Am I over time, or am I under time, or am I keeping you awake? Should I tell you a little bit more? Well, I'll get back to this then, because I do have a close, but I wanted to show a couple things that I thought were interesting. And let me apologize here. I go through how the British took over India by going into one kingdom, giving them guns, another kingdom giving them guns, and then they stirred up ancient animosities until they fought. And this was interesting. It's a tactic called psychological projection. Sigmund Freud coined the term, where rude people deny in themselves a negative quality, yet attribute that same negative quality to someone they don't like. We've all met someone like that. Little kids do that. I'm not the mean one, you're the mean one. And so you see this with wife beaters will beat the tar out of their wife, say, it's your fault because you provoked me. Or a Sharia man will rape a woman, say, it's your fault because you tempted me. And so the attacker blames the victim. It's called blame shifting. And it's gotten into politics. Karl Marx said, accuse others of what you do. So David Axelrod, a former campaign manager for a few presidents back, was on NPR radio, 2014. He says, in Chicago politics, we have a tradition where you throw a brick through your own campaign office window and then call a press conference to accuse your opponent of having done it. And so this is where you do the crime, but you accuse your opponent of. We saw this where there was a candidate colluding with Russia, giving away a fifth of the U.S. uranium in exchange for a $145 million contribution to her Clinton Foundation. And when it began to be uncovered, she paid for a dossier to accuse her opponent of colluding with Russia and use the investigation process to have all the evidence that could convict her destroyed, cell phones and hard drives and so forth. Why do you accuse them of the exact thing? Because the opponent's name gets associated with it in the media. Most people don't think lower than the headlines. And if they ever point back at the real person that's guilty, by that time, the water is muddied. And the public doesn't know who to trust, and they get a pass. There was another candidate that was extorting the Ukraine on tape saying, unless you stop investigating my son, I'm going to hold back a lot of money of the United States. What do? You accuse your opponent of extorting Ukraine and even put him through an impeachment trial. Why? Because their name gets associated with it in the media. Most people think, well, if there's smoke, there's fire. And anyway, so it's a tactic that's used every single day in the news. They'll say, this group is hateful when they're the hateful group. They'll say, you are intolerant when they're intolerant. They'll say, you're, racist and you're bigoted when they're the ones that are. They accuse you of the exact crime that they're guilty of. And you back up, and you can never back up enough because they just keep pushing and pushing and pushing. And anyway, so that's a tactic that is important to highlight. And let me get to a couple other slides that I think are interesting here. And you are so kind for doing this. Let's see here. Man, I must have had my file a little bit duplicated there. Oh, okay, this is what I'm going for. So how do you brainwash a nation? I thought this was fascinating. So in the 1800s, marketing was Sears catalog and Wells Fargo wagon. And they would list every single detail about a product. And then in the early 1900s, there's a brand new form of marketing called magazines. And they would market something without telling you what is in it. And they would have these, and so the classic is Crisco oil. nobody knew what was in Crisco oil. Do you know what's in Crisco oil? They made up a word, vegetable-based, but nobody knew what it meant. And they would put these slick ads showing happy families and everybody's using it, but still nobody knew what it was made of. So we go from listing every detail about a sewing machine to listing nothing and hiding it. You know what Crisco oil is made out of? Cottonseed oil. In the South, they had mountains of cotton seeds, and they would smash them into this mucky oil that they would use for machinery and factories. Nobody ate it. Somebody came up with the idea of boiling it and bleaching it and packaging it, and it was so successful it put out of business the lard industry. And so now we see that you can motivate people just by making it look like everybody's using it. And it is called keeping up with the Joneses. It's like you buy a product not because you know what it is or anything, but you see other people using it and you want to use it. So this is your decisions are being influenced by what you perceive other people are doing. And then we have sensationalism, and the Spanish-American War. It's called Yellow Press, and it was the famous quote that William Randolph Hearst told his artist, Frederick Remington, down in Cuba. He says, "You furnish the pictures and I'll furnish the war." And so this was saying the country was sort of disconnected. There was injustice going on in Cuba, and nobody cared. And so this idea that they could move you not just to buy a sewing machine or buy Crisco, they could move you to have your political views changed through this and magnifying it through the media. And then we have 1938 radio drama War of the Worlds, Orson Welles. We interrupt this program to announce that New Jersey is being invaded by Martians. The entire country freaks out. Everyone runs outside and looks up in the sky for Martians. It was a phenomenon. It was fear, this immediate electric fear, and everybody believed it. And then you had somebody that brought this all together named Joseph Goebbels. He was the propaganda minister for Hitler. And so they fanned the fear and panic of the war, and people in panic and fear will trade freedom for security. And he would orchestrate these Coliseum events with 100,000 people, and at the front they would begin to give the Hitler salute. And it would work its way back. And everybody would see everybody else giving the Hitler salute. And so they would say, everybody else is buying this product, everybody else is believing this ideology, and they would give it. This was studied after the war. And matter of fact, the U.S. Army got involved. And they had the U.S. Army's and Air Force Motion Picture Service in Hollywood. And so they made, what is our Army doing making movies? They would have recruitment tables in the lobby of the movie theater. They'd have a movie of a guy going off to war, right, being really heroic, and people would, I've talked to a guy, he signed up in the lobby of a movie theater. But it was this understanding. Now, agreed, this was for a good purpose because we were defending against terrible people. But this idea of making it look like everybody is doing something, influencing people, was studied after the war. It's called the Solomon Asch Conformity Experiment. And they did it on college campuses, and they would pull 8 students into a room. 7 of the students had been paid ahead of time to be actors. 1 was a naive participant. And the teacher would put 2 cards on the front desk. One card had 1 line on it, the other card had 3 lines on it, one longer, shorter, one the same. And beginning with the paid actor students, one by one, they would stand up and convincingly say that the shorter line was equal to the line on the first card. And by the time it got around to that 8th naive participant, 30% of them would deny their own eyes to go along with the group. They found if just one other one objected, it would go from 30% down to 5%. Right? So there is an encouragement for you to stand up to the narrative, realizing that you can influence a lot of people. But if nobody stood up, 30% of these guys would deny their own eyes and fit with the other group. And so this got into education, and it was called behavior modification. And they realized that they could mold the student by making it look like this is acceptable behavior, this is unacceptable, and if you don't go along with what they deem acceptable, they ridicule you or they mock you. So all the students want to be liked, They want to be friended. They want to be followed, right? And nobody wants to be unfriended and deleted and blocked. And they would manipulate, in other cultures, they call it honor-shame culture, right? And if you go along with the group, you're honored, and if you don't, and you're embarrassed, in Islamic culture, they'll even murder their own daughter if she embarrasses them in front of their group. And anyway, Peter was with Jesus for 3 years. And he's with a group around a fire. And an unnamed woman gets in his face and says, I saw you, you were with Jesus, you were with Jesus. And Peter looks over at the group and he sees that they're all staring at him and they're about to kick him out from being around the fire. He denies Jesus 3 times. Because if it was just him and that girl, he probably wouldn't have caved. But he looked over at that group and he didn't want to be. It's a powerful thing. Now, Peter, after the resurrection, and he's born again, filled with the Spirit, he'll stand up in front of the group and proclaim Christ, right? But it's a powerful thing. And if you don't know Jesus, you'll cave. And Jesus calls us to get rid of the fear of man and only have the fear of God. So basically, Jesus is calling us out of the group. He's calling us to not care what other people say about you. And now this was studied during the Korean War. These young men went into the military, loving America, patriotic. They get captured, they get rescued, they hate America. They're like, what happened to these boys? They did something called brainwashing. It comes from the Buddhist term of cleansing the mind. It's an emotional reset. And what they would do is they would put them in isolation and deprivation for a good long period of time until they craved, just wanting to get back to normal, wanting to have relationships with other people. And so they would bring them into a room with a half dozen chairs, and sitting in the chairs were guys who had already caved. And before they could be accepted into the group, they had to confess their whiteness. They had to confess the evils of the Western capitalist army that they were part of, and they were doing these terrible things. And when they finally rejected America, they were accepted into the group. And it's very similar to if there is an unruly dog that hates you, and you lock it in a room for a week, and you don't feed it, and you let it bark itself out, and it's scared, it's weak, it's like on the point of death, and then you crack open the door, and you give it some water and a treat, and you next day give it some water and a treat, next day give it some water, it is going to look at you as its new benefactor. And so this concept is taken national. You have the people go through a period of isolation and emotional trauma and deprivation, so much so that they craved things just getting back to normal. They say, oh, but before you get back to normal, you got to do this, you got to get a shot, you got to do this, you got to wear this, you got to, right? And anyway, I thought it was interesting. The study of this said that those that could resist were the ones who had a sense of humor. Right? They were like, oh, I'm not accepting the group. Well, big deal, they'll make light of it. And then added to the mix is gaslighting. And this is from a movie with Ingrid Bergman, 1944, from a play in the movie. She's the daughter of a famous actress who was given some royal jewels, but she died and all of her stuff's in the attic, and Ingrid Bergman keeps it locked because it's too emotional to go up there. And so some guy decides he wants to court Ingrid Bergman, and so she caves and they get married, and he puts her to bed, and then he wants to go for a walk, how those old black and white movies are, and when he goes out of the house, walks down the street, it's like all the London houses are like Mary Poppins are all together, and he goes across the roof and he goes in the window and he turns the gas lamp on in the attic to dig around looking for these jewels. Well, when he turns the gas on in the attic, the gas lamp in her bedroom gets a little dimmer. And this happens every night. And she says, whenever you leave to go for your walk, the light gets dimmer in my room. He says, oh, your eyes are playing tricks on you. You're seeing things. I think you might be going crazy. And then he shows her this really fancy watch. And oh, she likes it. And then they go to this fancy party. And in front of everybody, he says, my watch, it's gone. Somebody stole my watch. And he had slipped it into her purse. And he goes, oh, it's in your purse. You took it. You're a kleptomaniac. You stole it. And here, and she's like, I don't know. And he goes, it's okay. You're going crazy. You're having mental problems. And he convinces her that she's going nuts. And then he's going to sign her into an insane asylum. Until the hero of the movie follows the guy down the street, sees what he's doing in the lamps, and then they catch him and so forth. But this term has gotten into our vernacular. It's called gaslighting. You know, like guys that want to abuse girls, they try to, confuse them and so forth, but all it's done nationally. And it's when they control the media, when they control the internet, when they control everything, and they're building this thing where you think you're like an oddball crazy person unless you go along with this narrative that you're being fed. Now, I mentioned when the KGB agents would go into a country and they'd stir the riots, but they would co-opt the media with bribes and threats. Well, one of the things they would have the media do is release false polling data showing the popular leader is unpopular, so when they would do the coup, nobody would challenge it. And so this turned into what they call psychological operations, short for PSYOPs. And in America, during the Cold War, people were busy with their lives, and Allen Dulles is the head of the CIA, and he decides that we need to mobilize the country to the threat of communism, very similar to the Yellow Press with William Randolph Hearst in the Spanish-American War. And so Carl Bernstein, the Watergate investigator, he does an article with the Rolling Stone magazine, and he spills the beans. And he says the CIA has been feeding stories to the major television and news media in America to mobilize us to the communist threat. But this was the first time it was in print that the CIA is feeding stories to our major news media. And so now it's technical. Now it's the big tech. Now it's the Facebook, Twitter, Amazon, all these different groups. And so this is some articles. Big tech's effort to sway the election revealed. Tucker ruling allowed big tech to sway election. Twitter, social media sway voters, and so forth. And so it may or may not be the CIA, but it's definitely big tech, and they're the owners of these people, and they're using what we see to try to gaslight us and for a political opponent. Now, again, the approval of man can be manipulated. It's an ever-moving goalpost, but the Bible calls us to only want the approval of God. As long as you are constantly checking what everybody else says, then you can be susceptible. But when you say, I don't care whatever, I only care what Jesus says. I'm going to have fear of God, not fear of man. And anyway. So I think I've talked enough. But I do want to tell you one thing before we go. Someday you're going to be dead. That's a nice way to end a message. But you're going to be in heaven because you believe that Jesus died on the cross to pay for all your sins. And when we've been there 10,000 years, bright shining as the sun, with no less days to sing his praise than when we just begun, imagine you've been in heaven 10,000 years. You're walking the streets of gold, you meet Moses, maybe Moses will invite you over to his place. I don't know what it's like in heaven, but Jesus said, in my Father's house there are many mansions. So I bet Moses would have a pretty nice place. He'll probably have one of those big fireplaces where the logs don't burn out. Get it? The burning bush in the wilderness didn't burn up, and the logs in his fireplace didn't. I heard one preacher say, in heaven you'll travel as fast as you think, and I'll probably show up late. My wife will say, where were you? I was thinking about something else. I don't know. But imagine being there in Moses' living room. Maybe it's about the big size like this tonight. And after all the small talk's over, you say, Moses, tell us the story. What was it like? I mean, I read the book. I even saw the movie. And Moses will stand up, the room will get quiet, and he'll say, I was 80 years old, and Pharaoh, the most powerful military leader in the world, was charging in at us with these razor-sharp swords, this brand new invention called iron chariot wheels, and we were totally unarmed. And I stood there holding my staff, and I said, God, use me to rescue your people. And the waves came in and swallowed up Pharaoh's chariots. We're going to say, wow. We'll probably see it as a 3D hologram or something. I don't know. And then we'll look around the room and see David. Say, David, tell us your story. And the room will get quiet. David will stand up because I was just a teenager, 15, 16. And these grown-ups were too chicken to do anything. And this guy, Goliath, was mocking our God and mocking our faith. And I said, that's enough. I took my little sling, went out there and hit him in the head, took his own sword and chopped his head off. We're going to say, wow. Then we're going to see Gideon tell us, hey, Gideon. He said, well, there's 100,000 Midianites. I was able to get 30,000 Israelites. And God said, too many. Tell everyone that's scared to go home. Now I'm down to 10,000. Still too many. Go drink from a creek. Whittles it to 300. And then God says, watch this. And then we're going to have Deborah, the Apostle Paul, all the great saints of old. It's going to be really exciting. And then everyone at the table is going to look at you. So we haven't heard your story yet. Tell us, what did you do when it was your turn to be down on earth? What were they saying about God in your country? Or the baby that the Lord knew in the mother's womb? Or marriage that God himself instituted in Genesis? Man shall lead the father, mother, right? What did you do when the whole world was, what did you do when it looked hopeless? What did you do when you were backstabbed by some of your Christian friends? You were about to give up on everything. You just kept your eyes on Jesus. And like a little thread of faith, and just barely a string and a rope and a cord and a cable, and finally the blessing of God came back in your life. I'd hate for any of us to be up there and Jesus to walk in the room and have a big screen come down and all kinds of miracles happen and people coming to the Lord and him saying, that's what I had planned for you to do with your life, but you just didn't have enough faith and courage. And you look back at your life and that big mountain that held you back, it's just a little bitty anthill, this fear of man. What are people going to say? Am I going to get canceled? Or am I going to get blocked? Right? I let that little anthill of fear of man hold me back from doing all this great stuff for the Lord. And you can't go back to earth and do anything else for Jesus because you're already in heaven because you believe that Jesus died on the cross to pay for all your sins. But guess what? We're still on this earth. We still have breath in our lungs. We still have feet that trod the soil. You still can do those things that you will be known for forever. Moses is always going to be known to stand up to Pharaoh. David to Goliath, and you'll always be known. But you still have a chance to do more things. It's like a basketball game, or a soccer game, right? And you're on the bench, and Jesus is the coach, and he comes over and he slaps you on the back and says, okay, your turn, get in the game. And you're like, but coach, they're playing really tough out there. Yeah, I know, it's your turn, get in the game. It's like, but coach, somebody just got knocked down, look, they got kicked, they're on the ground. It's like, yeah, I know, you're 7 feet tall. You are really, really fast. They are 4 feet tall, they're really slow. You can do this. Greater is he that's in you than he that's in the world. Out of the 6,000 years of recorded human history, God chose you to be alive right now. He knows every dirty backroom deal. He knows all the corrupt people planning all that corrupt stuff, and he thinks you've got what it takes to turn things around. You've got what it takes to stand up for him. This is your finest hour. He has given you his spirit. He's given you his word. He's given you a tremendous pastor right here. He's given it all to you. This is your chance. Anyway, thank you so much. God bless you. I'm going to go ahead and turn it back over to Pastor.
We're given a lot of information. We're grateful. Allow the Holy Spirit to have it germinate in you. But what Bill ended with is absolutely what it gets to keep in mind. What are you going to do with this information? The most important thing, if you're not holding on to Jesus, you're going to miss it. So let God use you. He doesn't want you working for him. He wants you to work with him. And that's the key. So walk in him. And you can know all the history. But if you don't know him, and if you do not know his word, you will be easily swayed. But stand in him. Go in peace. May the Lord bless you.